Good morning. Welcome to today's Meet the Author event. We're thrilled to welcome Geraldine Brooks from her home in Martha's Vineyard. Last June, Geraldine visited us to talk about her books as a group, and that program ended with a teaser for her still unpublished novel, Horse. But now it's a year later and Horse is here, so we look forward to talking about this fascinating new book. This program is co-sponsored by Addis Israel in Washington, D.C. and Congregation Bethel in Bethesda, Maryland. We're grateful for the support of the Addis Israel Sisterhood, the Women of Bethel, and Bethel's Library Committee and Men's Club. On behalf of those groups, we warmly welcome all of you. In tribute to Geraldine and to Lexington, the racehorse, my Zoom background today is of the International Museum of the Horse in Lexington, Kentucky. This is Lexington's current home, or at least his skeleton's current home. So about Horse, from the lovely emails you've sent me, I know that many of you connected to this book on multiple levels. Some of you are horse lovers. Some of you are attracted by the art and artists in this book. Some got into the science, going behind the scenes at the Smithsonian to help to watch experts clean bones and restore paintings. And of course, if you were interested in all those things, you were in book heaven. But for many, the big draw of the book was the history and social justice themes, America's history of enslavement and its continuing toxic legacy today. And it was those themes that made us feel that Horse was a good selection for the book club. Over the past several years, both Addis Israel and Bethel have tried to take more action and offer more programming relating to anti-racism. So a novel on this topic seemed a fitting choice. Not to mention, of course, that any time is a good time to read a Geraldine Brooks novel. Before we talk about Horse, a few announcements about fall events. At our next book chat, we'll be discussing Who by Fire by Matti Friedman. This is a nonfiction book about singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen's impulsive trip to Israel during the Yom Kippur War and how he wound up entertaining the troops and the power of music and art in wartime. As you can see in the chat, you can choose from 3 different dates depending on whether you'd prefer a Zoom book chat or an in-person book chat at Addis or Bethel. In November, there are 2 lovely in-person author events, and if you are local, you are welcome to join for those. They're listed in the chat and described in more detail on the Addis Library webpage. Just Google Addis Israel Library. The next Meet the Author Zoom event is on December 4th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. We're excited to announce that European author Hans von Trotha will be joining us live from Vienna to talk about his new novel, Pollux Arm, which takes place in Rome during World War II. Again, registration for this Zoom event is in the chat. If you register early, you will automatically receive any bonus material sent out in advance of the programs. Now for today's program. Marge will introduce Geraldine Brooks. Then Geraldine and I will have a conversation about Horse. And then we'll open up the program for Q&A. You can purchase Horse from independent bookstore Politics and Prose in DC. See the chat box for the Politics and Prose link and discount code. So please go ahead, Marge, once you're spotlighted. I want to mention that Marge, who is in racing stripes in honor of Lexington, is also Zooming in from Chautauqua, the Chautauqua Festival, where Salman Rushdie was horribly attacked on Friday. And we hope and pray that, that Salman Rushdie recovers. And here is Marge. So go ahead whenever you're ready, Marge.
Okay, good morning. Also, I'm thrilled to welcome back Geraldine Brooks and to introduce her to you. Geraldine was born in Australia and grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney. She began her career in journalism at the Sydney Morning Herald, compiling data for horse and dog race stories. This was an experience which unexpectedly took on new value, we imagine, when she decided to write Horse. In 1982, Geraldine left Australia for New York City after winning a scholarship to the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University. Later, she worked for the Wall Street Journal as a foreign correspondent covering wars, famines, and other crises in the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. In 1990, with her husband, Tony Horwitz, she won the Overseas Press Club Award for Best Coverage of the Gulf War. Her first novel, Year of Wonders, one of my personal favorites, became an international bestseller, translated into more than 25 languages. Her second novel, March, won a Pulitzer Prize in fiction. Her other novels, People of the Book, Caleb's Crossing, and The Secret Chord, have each earned social acclaim, critical acclaim, and became New York Times bestsellers, as has her new novel, Horse. On top of all that, Geraldine is also the author of 3 works of nonfiction. We are so happy to have her with us today. Now for some tech details. While Robin and Geraldine are talking about Horse, you are welcome to reserve a place in line to ask a question during the Q&A period. You can do this by raising your electronic hand at any time. We will turn to your question during the Q&A period. The Q&A period will not be recorded, so no need to feel shy. To raise your electronic hand, click on the button labeled Reactions, which is probably located at the bottom of your screen. Then choose the option Raise Hand. If you later change your mind about asking a question, you can choose the option Lower Hand. Thank you. And please go ahead, Robin and Geraldine.
Thank you, Marge. Let's bring in Geraldine. So welcome, Geraldine.
Good
We're
morning.
so happy to have you visit again. You're a member of the extended Otis Israel family anyway, through your in-laws, the Horwitz family, who are longtime members. But even without that Otis and DC connection, you would still be part of this book club's family, because that's how much we appreciate all your books.
Well, thank you. It's great to be back with you all.
We're so happy to have you here. So before we talk about Horse, let me just ask you briefly about Salman Rushdie. You were actually the one who first told me about the attack on Friday, and we were all horrified by it. But maybe as a fellow author, it hit you from a different perspective. What do you make of?
It did hit me quite personally, and I heard through the little network of authors who are friends with Salman, and I have known him since the early 90s, when I was working for the Wall Street Journal out of London, and he was in hiding, and it was very difficult to see him at that time. And he actually came and had lunch at my house in Hampstead. Before he could come, a Scotland Yard detail had to go all through the house. It was a tiny house, mind you, but I didn't even know we had an attic until the Scotland Yard detective poked his head through a hatch in the ceiling, and we found out we had an attic. And when Salman came, he arrived with 5 bodyguards. So that was a very intense time. And yet in recent years, he has felt so safe and so at home in New York. And he really, has been living a completely normal, well, not even more than normal, a highly public life in New York City. And he's been a tireless advocate for writers at risk all over the world, and a real supporter of PEN. And actually, he was to have been speaking on the subject of writers in peril at Chautauqua when he was attacked. And this is something that we and certainly he had thought was in the distant past, after the Iranian president Khatami said that Iran had no further interest in pursuing this. But unfortunately, the way Valiatifah Islam works is the fatwa can only be lifted by the person who imposed it, and that person being Ayatollah Khomeini, who's been in his grave these many years, has not lifted it. So some very disturbed young man obviously was influenced by this. And to think it happened at Chautauqua, which is a place I absolutely love and have visited many times as a speaker, and brought my kids, and it's one of the safest places you can imagine, where you just let your kids go and run wild all day and meet you for dinner, even at very young ages. And it's a place that's been dedicated in recent decades to interfaith understanding. So to think that the attack happened there, I think, is doubly brutal. It's brutal for Salman, and it's brutal for the people of Chautauqua, that community. And I was very glad to hear that he's off the ventilator this morning and is able to speak. So that's good news.
Yes, yes. I hope that means that he's on the first steps to recovery. So we'll turn to horse. Let me ask you first about the first glimmering of the idea that became horse. The story I heard was that you were at a lunch at Plymouth Plantation.
Well, the first glimmering, it goes back a little bit before that. I have to make a confession that in my mid-50s, I was struck by the well-known disorder, which is horse craziness. And it happened quite unexpectedly, because as a kid growing up in the inner city, the idea of riding or having a horse wasn't something that was even in the ambit claim of imagination. I didn't even read pony club books. I didn't know anyone who was in a pony club. And so I'd never thought about riding. And then I happened to be at a conference in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it was held just outside the city on a beautiful ranch, a ranch where Willa Cather actually set her novel Death Comes for the Archbishop. And my room just happened to overlook the corral where all these gorgeous paint horses and Appaloosas and the lovely Western Wranglers were. And I was admiring the horses one day, and one of the Wranglers said, "You should come for a trail ride with us." And I said, "I can't ride." And he said, "Oh, you can. These horses know their job. They won't let anything happen to you." And the next day we were cantering through these gorgeous pink arroyos, and it seemed so effortless, and it was an ecstatic experience. And a few days later, when I was home, a young friend was over for dinner, and I was telling her about it, and she looked out the window and said, "You've got a few acres here. You could have a horse." And then she said, "I could give you my horse." A free horse. Anybody who knows anything about horses knows there's no such thing as a free horse. But I did not know anything about horses at that time, and I got very excited and fenced off my property, and then started to look into how to transport this horse, because this horse was not close by. This horse was in Mexico.
Oh,
Anyway, the horse arrived, and all I wanted to do was think about this horse and ride this horse and learn more about horses. And I wasn't getting actually any work done on the book I was writing, which was The Secret Chord. And suddenly Second Iron Age Israel wasn't quite as fascinating because there were no horses in it. And that was when I happened to be invited to the lunch at the museum that's now called Plymouth Pawtuxet Museum. And there was an official from the Smithsonian happened to be at the lunch. And he was down the table from me. He wasn't my luncheon companion or anything. But I started catching snatches of a conversation about a horse. And of course, I leaned across the table to hear more. And he was telling the extraordinary story of the greatest racehorse of the 19th century, and the twists and turns in the horse's magnificent career, and then what happened to the horse during the Civil War. And my lunch was uneaten, and my actual luncheon companion had not a scintilla of my attention because I knew I'd found my next book.
It's a wonderful story, the whole journey. So today, horse racing is so popular, but I understand that in the 19th century, it was a much bigger deal. What did you discover about that?
I was astonished to learn it was the national pastime of the 19th century. Everybody followed the horse racing. It crossed class, it crossed race, it crossed North and South. There were 3 newspapers dedicated just to covering the track. It was way bigger than the NFL. It was like the NFL would be if everybody actually had pads and a helmet, because most people had a horse or were very recently removed from having had a horse. So there was a huge involvement in this sport. And 20, 30, 40,000 people would turn up at the track for the most important match races. And the racing was very different too. You know, we consider the Kentucky Derby a long race, but actually the races of the 19th century were at least twice as long as a Derby race, and the horses ran that distance 3 times in the one day because it was a heat match. And the most famous horses were real celebrities, and the biggest celebrity of all was Lexington.
Yeah, after reading your book, I felt he was the most famous horse I'd never heard of. Just amazing. Turning more to the central core of horse, during your research, what did you discover about the connection between horse racing and slavery?
Well, that was the revelation to me. You know, I was attracted to writing a novel about a racehorse. And I soon realized that if I was going to pursue this subject, it would also have to be about race, because I learned very quickly that this vast thoroughbred racing industry of the 19th century was built on the plundered labor and skills of enslaved black horsemen. And so this was a fairly fraught swerve that the book took, because it was right in the midst of the discussion about white writers writing about black characters. And I hadn't known that I would be going there, but the only other way to write the novel would have been to center it on the white owners. And they are fascinating characters, and they're in the book to be sure. But that would have been erasing the contribution of the black horsemen, and I could not, in conscience, turn my back on those stories, which was so compelling. And, you know, it was a lot of research, because while every move the horse took is well documented in these racing newspapers, I can tell you basically stride for stride how he won every race and what happened to him. When he died, his obituary ran over about 6 pages of the newspaper. But the horsemen, you have to find in fits and starts and shards of information here and shards there. Fortunately, they were so important to the white thoroughbred owners that they are mentioned a lot in correspondence, because these men deferred to the expertise of their trainers, and they admired the skills of their jockeys. And so they wrote about these men, and we can find them there, which is very fortunate for a historical researcher. And only now are real historians actually unearthing the details of their lives and contributions.
It sounds like within slavery, these enslaved horsemen, they were a unique group as far as their privileges and certain abuses. What did you
No,
discover?
they had a distinctive status within this brutal system, where they did have somewhat more opportunity for a larger kind of a life and a little bit more autonomy and also some authority within the system. For instance, most enslaved people were banned from traveling across state lines, but that was not true for the Black Horsemen because they were required to take these horses often vast distances, often from south to north. So they traveled fairly freely. They were allowed, which was exceptional, they were allowed to accumulate property in their own name, and that led to many of them being able to afford their own emancipation over time. And then they became, freelance trainers and able to work for pretty good wages of the day and became quite respected people. But even when they remained enslaved, they would have special status and a better house and somewhat more autonomy and authority, but didn't stop many of them being sold off against their will and having their families ripped apart and all the other brutalities of the system.
That was one of the fascinations of your book, because it's so easy to think of slavery as a monolithic system.
Yes, actually,
yes.
One of my friends, the marvelous Jamaican American novelist Marlon James, said something that really influenced me. He said he's not interested in reading another account of slavery that is only about brutality and immiseration. He says if it's not also about resilience and about the full human experience, which includes joy and love and survival, then he's just not interested in it. So I tried to show those aspects too.
Yes, they come across very clearly in Horse. Let me ask you about Jarrett, the enslaved groom who had such a close relationship with Lexington. The chapter headings that just were his name were so powerful and jarring that he was Warfield's Jarrett. And then much later on, he was Alexander's Jarrett, and his name kept changing depending on who owned him. So brilliant. And what was the inspiration for him?
So the inspiration for him is a missing painting of Lexington done by the artist Thomas Scott, who's also a character in the novel. And equestrian painting is a very big part of the story. This is pre-photography, and so portraits of these thoroughbred horses were very important because that was how you advertised their stud services. And so painters would travel from horse property to horse property, painting the most remarkable horses of the day. And the painting is described in a couple of places, and it's described as Thomas Scott's best painting. And unfortunately, we have no idea what became of it, but it is entitled Lexington Being Led Out by Black Jarrett, His Groom. And I found Jarrett in the records of the farm, but I couldn't find out anything about him. So I had to then imagine this groom who was leading out the horse. And this painting was done towards the end of Lexington's remarkable career as a stud sire, where he sired more champions than any other racehorse.
I hope the painting resurfaces someday.
Wouldn't that be fabulous?
It would be fabulous. But talking about the art in Horse, when you were researching Thomas Scott and also his teacher, Edward Troy, and looking at their paintings, it sounds like you were struck by the way they depicted the Black groomsmen and trainers. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, because the discourse that is going on now about white representation of Black lives is an echo of a discussion that was started by Frederick Douglass in an article, in The Liberator, where he wrote quite provocatively that it was impossible for a white artist to do an accurate portrait of a Black subject, because white artists were too influenced by their own stereotypical view of Blackness, so that they could not see the individual. And I rested my argument on a wonderful research paper, which I've cited in my afterword, a Black art historian who's looked at the equestrian paintings of the day and the depictions of the Black trainers, jockeys, and grooms that are often accompanying the portrait of the horse, and says that these are individuals, and they are depicted with individuality and with authority and with great dignity, and in that way they're quite exceptional as depictions of Black individuals in that period. And I found that so fascinating. So one of my characters, Theo, is an art historian, and I purloined these insights and gave them to him.
Yes, and we sent out the paintings that you had talked about, images as a bonus drop, so that people could see just what you and Theo were saying, that they have a lot of dignity, and the artists have respect for their skills.
I love the painting that that I have Theo describe in great detail in the novel, which is it's a portrait of a racehorse, a very renowned racehorse called Richard Singleton, and it says Richard Singleton with Harry, Charles, and Lou, and the Harry is the Harry Lewis, who was the trainer of Lexington and responsible for Lexington's early success. So it was absolutely marvelous to have this portrait of Harry Lewis that I could look at and refer to, and see, you know, the immense authority and almost impatience of the man, as if he's saying, you know, will you get out of my way and let me get on with my work, is the expression that he imparts from the canvas.
It is a wonderful painting. So maybe this is a good time to turn to since we've already mentioned it, the sensitive topic of cultural appropriation, about who gets to tell a story. And in this case, who gets to tell a story of African Americans? And in Horse, you write from the vantage point of many characters, but two of them are Black men, Jarrett and Theo, the 21st century graduate student. It was a bold decision. What was your feeling about taking on that responsibility? And did you have any trepidation about it?
Oh, yes, I did. I did. And I have to say, you know, I was perfectly expecting to, you know, find myself in a bit of a firestorm. And I'm very relieved that the book has not been received that way, because I was quite frankly, looking at macadamia farms in remote Australia to see where I could go if I got totally cancelled.
Oh my God.
But it looks like my future may not be in macadamia farming yet. I don't want to speak too soon, but there's been some commentary, but it's been very fair-minded in my view, and not in the least you know, direly critical. It's taken issue with one or two things, but I did feel an enormous responsibility, and I relied on the generosity and patience of Black friends who were kind enough to share their own lived experiences with me as I was trying to create the contemporary character, and also to read early drafts and tell me where I was tone deaf or got something wrong. And so, you know, to the extent that it's right, it's because of that generosity and patience. And I know how tiresome it is for Black people to be asked to explain racism to racist white people. So I did really appreciate that. And when it comes to writing about characters in the past, I think you're always out on a limb there. And it's very similar no matter what unheard voice you are trying to recapture, because nobody really knows from this distance what it was like to live in the 1850s as a woman, as as an enslaved Black person. So you can rely on the oral histories that are available, but they are, obviously taken, generally speaking by a white interlocutor. So you have to take it with a grain of salt that the subject of the interview might not have been fully forthcoming. And then you just have to try and summon some kind of radical empathy. And I think that for me, it all rests on the fact that no matter what period of time you're talking about, whether it's Second Iron Age Israel or antebellum Kentucky, human emotions don't change that much. And I think we can all access and imagine what it was like to be afraid and what it was like to be cold and hungry and in pain and uncertain about the security of your relationships, because those things don't really change.
Yes, you give us all of that so brilliantly in all of your novels. With the research into Theo, like into a contemporary Black man, you interviewed your friends. I'm just sort of trying to picture the process. Was it one by one, or did you have a group so that they could brainstorm together?
No,
Or
so I'm lucky that I live on Martha's Vineyard, because this place has been a Black summer resort for more than a century and a half. And I am lucky that I have close Black friends. And we have talked over the years about aspects of their experience. And one thing that I have learned for sure from them, that no amount of education, wealth, or privilege protects you if you have Black skin in this society. And I think we're all familiar with one of the more famous cases, which is Professor Henry Louis Gates, who was hauled off his own front porch in Cambridge in handcuffs and arrested for the crime of trying to open his own front door. And that, unfortunately, is not an uncommon experience. I have another great friend here who is a very distinguished filmmaker who was driving her Land Rover and was pulled over by a racist cop and made to sit in the filthy gutter while he checked that she owned the car, because he didn't think a Black woman could own such a nice car.
Oh.
So, there were things like that I already had in my mind. I'd been told these things, and as I think a lot of white people are shocked and outraged, but it's just a day in the life for a lot of Black people.
yes. Horse is your second novel, set around the time of the Civil War. And I understand that you married into this interest, that you didn't start out your life as a Civil War enthusiast.
Well, I did.
You can tell us about that.
I've made a lot of fun of my wonderful late husband, Tony Horwitz, for being a Civil War bore and absolute, Civil War tragic all his life. And I think his mom and sister may be joining this Zoom. And his mom encouraged him to paint the entire attic floor of the family home with scenes from the Civil War when he was 8 years old. And so when I first met him and we went to sleep in that attic, we were surrounded by rebels and Yankees fighting it out on every wall. It was an unrestful place. But then we did go to live in Waterford, Virginia, which is a marvelous, marvelous antebellum town not far from Washington. And that was when we encountered the hardcore Civil War reenactors who liked to camp in our barn. And so, yes, so we were right in the thick of it.
Tony's mom sounds like the kind of mom Jess has in Horse, that she'll let you burn down the house if that would be educational. So what about historical fiction in general? What's the attraction for you in writing historical fiction? You're so talented, you could probably write in other genres. Why do you choose historical fiction?
I think it was just, that was the story that first grabbed my imagination. My first novel about the little village in the Peak District in England that quarantined itself voluntarily in 1665 when bubonic plague struck. And I was just so taken with imagining what that might have been like, how you brought a community to a consensus to make such a self-sacrificing act, and then how people dealt with the very dire consequences of having done that when so many villagers died who could have saved themselves if they had have fled. But on the other hand, not one outbreak of the bubonic plague was ever traced to the Im outbreak. So it really was an effective self-sacrifice. But just imagining that. And so because that was my first novel and because people wanted to read it, I got to write more. And it appeals to me to find something from the historical record that if you made it up, it would seem implausible. But because it actually happened, you have the permission to write something that is implausible. For instance, Caleb's Crossing, about the first Native American graduate of Harvard. If I had made up a story that a young man born on the island of Martha's Vineyard at the time of the first English settlers in the 1630s would have mastered Latin and Greek and gone off to graduate from Harvard with the sons of the Puritan colonial elite, that would have been so ridiculous. And yet it happened. And so that attracts me. And it's also, it's a very nice thing for a novelist to have the arc of the story, the spine of the narrative in your hand, so you know how it ends. And so you can shape everything according to what actually happened. And it's a great assist to have that line of fact to follow until the line becomes too faint, and then to use your imagination for the rest.
Well, we're so glad that you do. We had another author, Rachel Kadish, who visited us, and she said something that for me resonates with what you just said. She talked about historical fiction as an act of repair. And I'm wondering if that idea resonates with you. She says that fiction can recover lives that passed unnoticed through history's sieve because they were too poor, or they were female, or they were Black, or they were some way not deemed relevant or significant. And I wonder if that idea resonates for you, that historical fiction can be an act of repair.
Very much so, and I've always characterized it as hearing the unheard. For me, that's what it's all about, is retrieving the lost voices, the people who didn't get a chance to set down their stories, and finding those voices. And it's very interesting, how you can sometimes find them. And I found that one of the best places to find them, sadly, is in court, because that is where they took verbatim testimony, and you can hear people speaking in their own words.
So fascinating. So fascinating. I'm going to remind people, I have some more questions to ask, but I want to remind people that you can raise your electronic hand at any time, and then you'll already be in the queue to ask Geraldine your own question when we turn to that. So we're historical novels. Do you have plans to write another one? And if so, can you tell us what time period you're thinking about?
Oh boy. I do. I have another project that I want to do first, which is a nonfiction project. But I do have another historical novel in mind. But if I tell you the time period, it will blow your mind.
All right. Well, that's enough of a tease. And the happy news is that there is one that's at least in the planning stages. So let me, I'll pause here and turn to audience questions, and I'll repeat. I'll actually stop the recording, and then I'll repeat Marge's instructions.